Thank you so much, Charles, and the organizers for this incredibly interesting panel. It's a treat to be here. And today I'm going to talk about race and ethnicity and intergenerational mobility. I'm going to be brief by necessity because unfortunately we don't have as much research on this topic as we should. So let me first introduce this with how do we usually measure intergenerational mobility, that is mobility between parents and their adult children in the US. And then I'm going to tell you this is not the way we should use for comparing racial and ethnic groups. So here we need to measure the mobility between the parents, the situation, in this case, the income of the parents when the children were growing up, and then the income of those children when they become adults, right? So this is based on work by my colleague Raj Chetty, very important work. And the way this is done usually in the US and in other countries is we rank parents, their families, by their income from the poorest families here all the way to the wealthiest families, right? And then this is the horizontal axis, and then in the vertical axis, we do the same with their children. And then we draw a line that captures, it's a summary measure of the association between the parents' income and the adult kids' income. This is what we learn here. The association in this case is 0.34. This doesn't tell us a whole lot if we don't place this in context. We compare that, right? Which we're going to move to. But let me give you some parameters to think about this. What is a situation of perfect mobility? Perfect mobility, meaning there's no association between parents and children's income. Your parents don't determine at all how well you do in life, would be captured by a horizontal line, right? If you see in the vertical axis, we have the children. The idea is everyone gets the same on average. Of course, there's a lot of variation, regardless of how poor or wealthy your parents were. Now we're going to look at the other extreme, perfect immobility, if something like immobility could be perfect, right? And you can imagine already this is a perfect diagonal line, right? Meaning whatever your position your parents had, you have in your generation as a child the same position. If your parent is in the 40th percentile, you yourself are in the 40th percentile. So in the US, we have a situation somewhere in the middle, immobility, but not perfect immobility, right? So this is the usual way in which we measure mobility. That's not the right way if we're interested in what our concern is today, differences between racial and ethnic groups. Think of the following situation. The red line is one group in the society who are on average a lot more advantaged than the blue line. At any level of parental income, the red guys make more money, right? So what do we learn here based on what I showed you before? Well, the blue line here represents disadvantaged minorities such as African Americans or Latinos in our country, right? What do we learn here? Well, if you look just at the slope, the blue line, the disadvantaged group, is more mobile, right? Because it has a flatter slope. However, at the same time, the racial disparities between the groups are widening, meaning because the two groups are converging to different means in income, right? So this is not the way we want to go to compare groups within our society. So how do we want to do this? The way I'm going to do this is looking at what we call directional mobility. First of all, upward mobility from a situation of disadvantage. The idea here is if you grew up in a situation of disadvantage or poverty, what are your chances to improve your situation compared to your parents? And this is what we find in America when we compare whites with blacks. First, or to your left, we have the chances of moving up from the poorest 20% of households. So those households in poverty or a little bit above poverty. And what we find is enormous racial disparities, right? Whites in red have a 75% chance of moving upwards from poverty. Blacks of similar origins with similar parents have only a 48% chance. If we compare the chances of moving upward from the poorest 50% of households, we find the same. Whites have a chance of moving upwards of 45%, blacks only 22%. Let's look at the other component of directional mobility. That is, this is moving upwards from poverty. Let's look at moving downwards from affluence or comfort, right? So here we have the same, but it's kind of the reverse image. Now, whites have only a 60% chance of dropping from the top 20% of households. Blacks have a higher chance of dropping from advantaged origins. The same is repeated when we look at those whose parents were in the top half of the income distribution. Whites only a 37% chance of falling, but whites more than 60% chances. This is easy to summarize, right? The opportunity for mobility is immensely racially asymmetrical in the US. In other words, whites have a much higher chance of racing for poverty, and blacks have a much higher chance of dropping from comfort, right? Or we can say the same thing in slightly different ways. For blacks, it's much more likely to reproduce poverty, and for whites, it's much more likely to reproduce advantage. Okay, this is a work that look at people born around the 1960s, right? Many things have changed over time, as we have discussed today, this morning, and we're gonna look at changes over time. How are we gonna do this? Looking at people born, this is the year of birth, so people born from 1945 all the way to 1980, so you could say from the baby boomers all the way to the millennials, right? And we're gonna look here at the probability of upward mobility from poverty for blacks and whites in America. So whites in red, you see that the probability of moving up from the 20th percentile, that family that's low in the distribution, is constant over time. About 70% doesn't change much. Among blacks, however, there's substantial improvement in the chances of moving upwards. This is good news in terms of racial equality, right? And so what could have driven this? First of all, let me say what could have not driven it. Given the substantial change over birth cohorts in a relatively short period of time, the explanation for this convergence, racial convergence in mobility, cannot be differences in endowments such as innate ability, any innate attributes between racial groups. Those things don't change so fast, or don't. So instead of considering individual attributes, this finding strongly suggests that it's policies, right? And the important work by Rucker Johnson, who presented this morning, suggests in particular that policies such as Head Start, the school desegregation, court-mandated desegregation, and school finance reform, equalizing the resources of disadvantaged and schools serving disadvantaged and advantaged kids, played a role in closing this racial gap in mobility. Which factors may have been at play? We don't know for sure, but this is, to some extent, a story of resources, including economic, educational, health, and nutrition resources that these policies provide to disadvantaged populations, but also there might be a role played by important factors such as peer effects of more integrated school environments, right? and the change in expectations for children of different races and ethnicities' successes. This, of course, highlights the enormous importance of institutions in changing gaps, racial gaps, and promoting opportunity. Very quickly, because I'm running out of time here, which things I didn't show you and I wish I could have shown you. First of all, the findings here are based on very small samples, which is the best we have at the moment. But this topic, such a relevant topic, calls for research using large data sets based, if at all possible, on administrative records. And also, I've restricted my analysis to white and black Americans. This is not by choice. It's what we can do with the data we have, but we should urgently include other racial ethnic groups. I said particularly Hispanics, just because they're now, or we are now, I should say, 18% of the American population, 23% of the births. We know nothing in terms of intergenerational mobility, but also other groups. And with this, I close. Thank you.